Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Monday, October 13th, 2025. This is USA Today's The Excerpt. Today, all remaining living Israeli hostages have been released. Plus, nearly half of states are in recession. What's that look like in your neck of the woods? And we take a closer look at the history behind the Insurrection Act. Hamas has released all 20 remaining living hostages taken in the October 7, 2023 attacks on Israel. That was the scene as a crowd cheered near Re'im military base in Israel as a convoy believed to be carrying released hostages drove past. The moves are part of the first phase of a peace plan brokered by the U.S. Nearly 2,000 detained Palestinians are being released by Israel as part of the deal. Israel's onslaught in Gaza also remained paused for a third day yesterday as many Gazans work their way home, often with rubble greeting them. As part of the ceasefire agreement, humanitarian aid will be ramped up in Gaza. Large crowds have gathered across the enclave in recent days to receive supplies like these in Khan Yunis. President Donald Trump traveled to the Middle East to greet the released hostages as part of a visit to Israel and Egypt. He was clear about the war in speaking with reporters aboard Air Force One.
The war is over, okay? You understand that?
Before Trump's remarks to Israel's parliament this morning, he wrote in a guest book that it was his great honor and a great and beautiful day. You can read more on usatoday.com. Nearly half of the states are in a recession, while many others could be approaching one. I caught up with USA Today money and personal finance reporter Medora Lee to discuss. Medora, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So according to this data, Medora, how many states are in a recession right now?
According to Moody's Analytics economist Mark Zandi, 21 states and the District of Columbia are all in a recession right now. And those 22 places account for about a third of U.S. economic activity.
Wow. Well, in terms of some of the factors at play here, why are some states in or near recession?
21 states in the District of Columbia are actually in a recession, he says, and another 13 are just sort of treading water, like they can just kind of go either way at any moment. And so he says that something that they all have in common is a lot of them are states or areas that produce goods, and goods are really not faring very well right now, partly because of the tariffs and the restrictive immigration policy that we've had under the Trump administration, and also the District of Columbia, which doesn't really produce a lot of goods, but was really hit by the Department of Government Efficiency federal job cuts. So those are kind of the things that are really hurting those states the most.
Why are some states doing better, Medora? What's their secret?
The states that do better, like Texas and Florida, generally always do pretty well because they have low taxes, kind of lower cost of living. And then they usually have industries that are doing pretty well right now. And those include technology and state and local government spending and real estate. Pennsylvania was actually one on the upside. And Zandy, he says it's because healthcare and education are sort of driving that state, led by things going on in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh.
All right, interesting. Well, California and New York seem to be straddling the line of recession, right? I mean, what's going on in those states and why is that data so significant?
Yeah, so California and New York have been hit by property issues. I mean, California's had a lot of property issues because of climate issues and wildfires. And New York saw an exodus of people not going back to the office for a while. And the cost of living is very high there. And so Zandy says that really California and New York together, they account for more than a fifth of the U.S. economy. And so they have to stay stable for us, the entire country, not to fall into recession. He says if one of them goes, probably it'll take the rest of the nation with it. And then for sure, we're going to hit recession.
All right, makes sense. Well, you mentioned the rest of the nation. I mean, what are the chances, Medora, of a nationwide recession at this point? What's the overall prognosis for the coming months or year ahead?
Nobody really knows whether we're going to recession. Everybody's opinions are all over the place. And I guess it's just partly because of his analysis. It kind of depends on where you're standing, right? What view you have, what state you're in. But overall, most of the economists who look at the entire nation, most of them don't think we're going to have a full-blown recession. Some of them say that we might have very slow growth, but not necessarily a big recession. And I think that Mark Zandi is also towing that line, except that maybe he's slightly more pessimistic, it seems, because we just had a GDP report that was pretty strong, 3.8%, which is higher than what most people expected. And they say that consumer spending is driving the GDP growth, but he's more pessimistic, saying that the consumer spending is really just led by wealthy people. And so how sustainable is that going to be? Because we're supposed to be seeing higher prices because of tariffs. But he says the main thing that he would look at is layoffs. So far, layoffs have been very low. And he says as long as they kind of stay low, we probably won't hit a recession. But he says that people will probably feel still very uncomfortable is his adjective, because companies have stopped hiring and they've cut hours. They've basically done everything but layoffs. And so it's not like the economy is really chugging. It's just sort of staying in status quo. But if we start to see the layoffs, we might fall into recession. Risks that are lurking is this government shutdown. It's now in its second week. And if it continues for a month or two, that could also be the trigger that kind of pushes us into recession. Or if a lot of this is earnings season and a big artificial intelligence companies, people have really banked a lot on them. And if they just see just a slight slowdown in revenue, that could be disappointing. Instead of 100% growth, we might see like 95% growth. People might freak out and that could hurt. Or, Trump is about to nominate someone to replace Fed Chairman Powell next year. And if he chooses someone people hate, that could also cause problems. Or if countries decide to retaliate against the US because of their tariffs, which we haven't seen a lot of, but what if something happens and the trade wars take a turn? Or the big one is the Fed has started to cut rates. And what if they start to cut rates too aggressively? Inflation's already kind of sticky. And if it picks up even more, that could cause problems.
Right. Fingers crossed. Medora Lee covers money and personal finance for USA Today. Thank you, Medora.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Top Republicans and Democrats yesterday dug in their heels as the government shutdown continues. Democrats call for healthcare concessions before they vote to reopen the government. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries on Fox News Sunday accused Republicans of viewing healthcare as an extraneous issue, saying people throughout this country should be able to afford to go see a doctor when they need one for themselves, their family, their children. House Speaker Mike Johnson hit back on the same show, saying that 8 times now, Democrats in Congress have voted to close the government. Meanwhile, at least 4,000 civil service workers were notified on Friday that they were being laid off rather than simply furloughed, as in past shutdowns. The administration warned that more are coming. You can stay with all the latest on usatoday.com. President Trump says he'd consider invoking the Insurrection Act of 1807 to fight crime and battle protesters in Democratic-controlled cities. So how exactly has the act been used throughout American history? I spoke with USA Today domestic security correspondent Josh Meyer for more. Josh, as always, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure, Taylor.
All right, well, Josh, let's work our way through this timeline as you do a great job of here in the piece, starting with the Whiskey Rebellion and then the passing of the Insurrection Act itself in the early 1800s. Can you just put some of these early events in context for us?
So the first time that the Insurrection Act was used in an earlier form was in 1794, and that was the Whiskey Rebellion. And basically, President George Washington invoked something called the Militia Acts of 1792, and he did so to put down an armed uprising in western Pennsylvania where farmers were rebelling against the federal whiskey tax that had just been enacted. And Washington is said to have personally led more than 10,000 militia troops in what is believed to be the first and only time a sitting president has commanded troops in the field. I actually learned something new when I was reporting this story, which is the Insurrection Act was passed in 1807. But what I didn't know is that basically President Thomas Jefferson made sure that the act was passed to unilaterally federalize the militia of any state and use the armed forces and deploy them in response to requests by governors or state legislatures or on his own. And he did so in this case because Aaron Burr, after he won the duel with Alexander Hamilton, he tried to muster a private army and seize land in the Southwest because killing Hamilton ruined his political career. And so Jefferson basically said, we need to send the army down there to make sure that he doesn't try to create his own little country within the United States.
It's a fascinating little nook of American history there. How about in the years during or shortly following the Civil War, Josh?
On April 15th, 1861, President Abraham Lincoln invoked the Insurrection Act and called up 75,000 militia troops following the secession of 11 southern states. And also, Confederate troops had attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina's Charleston Harbor. So basically, Lincoln knew that there was a war coming, and to suppress the rebellion and restore federal authority, he invoked the Insurrection Act, and that marked the beginning of the Civil War because he wasn't able to quell the rebellion quickly enough. And of course, the Confederate Army then went on to fight for years before they were ultimately defeated. And after the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, President Ulysses S. Grant used the Insurrection Act several times to quell rebellions by the Ku Klux Klan and others who didn't want to accept the fact that slaves were illegal and that Black people had voting rights.
All right, so moving forward another few generations, what are some of the major labor union battles we saw in the later 19th and then early 20th century relating to this act?
The Insurrection Act was used again from 1894 to about 1921 to quell labor union rebellions and strikes. So the first one was called the Pullman Strike. It was a railway strike. President Grover Cleveland deployed troops to Illinois over the governor's objections to break what was called the Pullman Railway Strike. He said it was interfering with interstate commerce and mail delivery, and ultimately the railway workers had to go back to work. In 1914, President Woodrow Wilson invoked the Insurrection Act to combat a Colorado labor uprising, and then President Warren Harding invoked it in 1921 to quell an uprising by coal miners in West Virginia.
And Josh, I know we saw this pop back up in big ways later in the 20th century. How so, be it during the Civil Rights era or even in the years since?
In the Civil Rights era, from 1957 to 1968, 3 presidents invoked the Insurrection Act. Dwight Eisenhower first federalized the National Guard and then, for the first time in American history, deployed the 101st Airborne Division of the U.S. Army to enforce desegregation in Arkansas after the governor there actually used the National Guard to block 9 Black students from entering a Little Rock high school. So after that, John F. Kennedy, when he was president, invoked the act to enforce desegregation orders at the University of Mississippi in 1962. And then famously in 1963, Governor George Wallace in Alabama said that he would personally stand in the schoolhouse door and block the admission of 2 Black students to the all-white University of Alabama. So Kennedy sent the troops down there to make sure that the students got in. And then President Lyndon Johnson invoked the act again several times in 1967 and 1968, first sending troops into Detroit during riots there. And then in 1968, basically there were riots around the country after the assassination of Martin Luther King. So he sent troops into Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Chicago, and other cities to quell uprisings there.
All right, and then even more recently, Josh, an event that you were there, right? The Los Angeles riots. What can you tell us about those and how the Insurrection Act came up then?
Correct. I was working at the Los Angeles Times in L.A., and President George H.W. Bush invoked the act on May 1st, 1992, after the acquittal of some LAPD police officers who severely beat Black motorist Rodney King. And that, of course, the video of that went viral on TV. We didn't have the internet back then, but the acquittal of the officers sparked riots throughout South Central Los Angeles and elsewhere. I mean, there were active gunfights and arson fires. It looked like a war zone, and I was out there covering it. And President Bush deployed the National Guard and U.S. troops to restore order after the California governor and the mayor of Los Angeles requested federal assistance. And I can tell you, it was quite the scene. There were tanks rolling down the streets. At least 53 people were killed, 2,380 were injured, and 12,000 people were arrested. And property damage estimates were more than $1 billion, which at the time made it the most destructive period of local unrest in U.S. history.
All right. Josh Meyer covers domestic security for USA Today with a great breakdown on a term that we've heard a lot about, the Insurrection Act, here on the Excerpt. Thank you, Josh.
Sure.
And before I go today, I need to let you all know this will be my last week with the Excerpt. Over the past decade and more than 3,000 shows, I've made it my mission to bring you the news of the day. Thanks for being such a loyal audience these last 10 years. The time has come for me to move on to my next adventure, but USA Today is excited to bring you deeper into the news with more conversations in news, politics, sports, entertainment, and beyond. Friday, October 17th, will be my final show. My colleague Dana Taylor, along with a regular mix of USA Today Network reporters, will be here for you beginning October 20th to continue the outstanding coverage you've come to expect from the Excerpt. I'll have more in the coming days. And thanks for listening to the Excerpt. You can get the podcast wherever you get your audio, and you can email us at podcasts@usatoday.com. I'm Taylor Wilson. I'll be back tomorrow with more of the Excerpt from USA Today.